For the most part, drugs coming in through Canada is a very small issue, certainly compared to the southern border. And so that's been sort of one of the complexities is that it's comparing apples and oranges, for lack of a better term, in terms of the magnitude. It certainly seems that to compare both borders from a threat to national security standpoint doesn't necessarily equate out. We'll see what happens. I mean, Mexico is planning on sending out 10,000 troops to help with security. We'll see how effective that actually is at stemming the flow of, fentanyl and other illegal drugs into the United States. Obviously, the U.S. has a long history of trying to apply supply side approaches to combat drugs, and that has not always been the most effective. It certainly seems that this strategy would be something that would be, let's say, more easily or more favorably viewed by the U.S. legal system. And so we'll have to see. I mean, there's been reporting in the Wall Street Journal discussing a desire to essentially reopen negotiation of the USMCA agreement early. That's due for renegotiation in 2026. But in general, we just have to, see what happens from this. The big thing is with Michigan's economy is we are the most exposed of any state to a substantial increase with tariffs from goods from Canada coming into our state for consumption, especially intermediate inputs used by the auto sector. So last year we imported over $8.4 billion of auto parts, and then we also exported a lot of auto parts as well. No, depending on what retaliatory tariffs would look like, it's hard to say how the exports would be hit in that sector. But certainly we'd be looking closely at what does that increase in cost of those inputs due to the competitiveness of vehicles made in the great state of Michigan. No, not that I can say. I do think one of the challenges with this conversation is it's fairly widely recognized that actually the biggest source of drugs being trafficked from Mexico into the United States are Americans. And so I think the big open question is whether any of the approaches that are going to be implemented will ultimately be effective in this matter. Hopefully they can be, but what can be said for sure is that while there is so much uncertainty about whether tariffs will or will not be implemented, that is not something U.S. businesses want because if they're thinking about doing capital investment, as an example, with a lot of uncertainty, you tend to delay those investment decisions until clarity manifests itself. And so right now, a lot of this is a waiting game. I would expect that a lot of U.S. importers that bring goods in from Mexico, if those goods have a long enough shelf life, that they will certainly try to bring in a lot over this next month while this essentially grace period is in effect, just in case come March, they do see the tariffs on Mexican goods take effect. Is one, it's too early to say. I know the president right now is, I believe, said at 3 o'clock he's speaking with Prime Minister Trudeau again. So we'll see what comes out of that conversation. And the one thing then for everybody to recognize is we do still have 10% tariffs going in place on everything imported from China um, tomorrow. And that is also 10% on top of what already may be in place. Another aspect of this that hasn't been talked about as much, and it seems is taking place regardless. So again, we're still seeking clarity on this, is a closure of what's called the de minimis rule. And what that means is that a American citizen currently could import, let's say, $500 of goods from Canada, and those goods would not be subject to tariff, even if there was a tariff in place. It appears that the executive order is closing the de minimis rule for Canada, Mexico, as well as China. That affects the fulfillment operations of Shein and Temu. As an example, they tend to rely very heavily on shipments originating in China coming to the United States that essentially clear customs tariff free because they're under the $800 per day limit. And so that is something that it appears that is likely taking effect regardless. Again, we're still searching for clarity, but there's already been academic research done that suggests that the closure of the de minimis rule, which is being argued as needed because of drugs coming in that way will disproportionately affect the least fortunate individuals in the United States. So lower income households will be disproportionately affected by the closure of that rule. This also will challenge of the Amazon Haul fulfillment model that had been implemented to essentially serve as a competitor to Shein and Temu because those models rely very extensively on this de minimis rule. Exactly. And so we had seen Shein and Temu opening fulfillment centers in the United States, so essentially adopting a more traditional sort of e-commerce fulfillment model akin to what Amazon has. But that was only for some sets of their goods, not for all of them yet. And so what we will see is the closure of the de minimis rule will make things, more expensive if you are going to be buying from some of those sites because essentially the sort of tariff-free status will be eliminated. No, absolutely. So the big reason Michigan is so affected by tariffs with Canada is, in general, business relationships tend to be fairly geographically close because the price of transporting goods is so much. And so if you're a factory in Michigan, it's often going to be cheaper to buy goods in Canada than it would be to buy, let's say, from South Carolina. It's a much longer transportation trip from South Carolina to Michigan than, let's say, from Ontario here into Michigan. And so we're disproportionately affected because we're one of the states that exports the most to Canada. And that is very heavily in finished motor vehicles produced here in Michigan, as well as motor vehicle parts and motor vehicle chassis, and also iron and steel. And then we import, for example, a lot of iron and steel, aluminum, machinery, and of course, motor vehicle parts and finished vehicles from Canada. And so, because we're so geographically close to Canada, our economic activity is much more strongly tied to Canada than states that are much further away. So, I used to live in Colorado, and there's not that much of a trade relationship between those two states in comparison. Those type of programs, we did them in the United States. For example, in 2019, we spent, I believe, somewhere to the tune of $23 billion bailing out farmers because of reduced agricultural exports as China dramatically curtailed soybean purchases. So this is something that doesn't surprise me. It would potentially suggest that Canada is expecting this to move forward. And then we'll also be seeing again what happens over in China is they try to figure out what to do in response to these tariffs that apparently will take effect tomorrow.